October 27, 1944. Hill 617. Vosges Mountains, eastern France. The rain had poured for 3 days straight. In the dense pine forests of the Vosges, visibility shrunk to less than 10 feet. The temperature hovered just above freezing, turning the mountain paths into streams of sludge. Somewhere in this hellscape, 275 men of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, the Alamo Regiment from Texas, huddled in shallow foxholes, surrounded by German troops, running out of ammunition, food, and hope. They had been trapped for 3 days, victims of a command decision that would become one of the most disputed in American military history. Now, as German artillery slowly pounded their perimeter, their only hope rested with an unlikely rescue force, Japanese-American soldiers whose own families remained imprisoned in American concentration camps. What unfolded over the next 6 days would become the stuff of legend, a rescue mission so costly that the rescuers suffered more casualties than the number of men they saved. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would lose more than 800 men to save 211 trapped Texans. In doing so, they would shatter German assumptions about American combat ability and force America itself to confront its own prejudices. This is the story of the Lost Battalion rescue, one of the 10 most significant ground engagements in U.S. Army history. According to military historians, it is a story of unbelievable courage, questionable command decisions, and the price of proving loyalty in blood. The crisis began on October 24, 1944, with a decision that violated basic military doctrine. Major General John Ernest Dahlquist, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, ordered the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, to advance beyond friendly lines into the heavily forested Vosges Mountains. The objective: seize high ground near Biffontaine and cut German supply routes. Lieutenant Martin Higgins, the battalion's operations officer, instantly recognized the danger. The unit would be advancing without flank protection, without reserves, and without a secure supply line. The narrow logging road that served as their only lifeline to friendly forces could be easily severed by German troops. But Dahlquist, operating from headquarters miles behind the lines, insisted on an aggressive push. By noon on October 24, the battalion had moved roughly 4 miles and reached their objective, a narrow ridge labeled Hill 205. They established defensive positions among the pine trees and waited for the rest of the regiment to link up. That link-up never came. The German 19th Army under General Friedrich Wyss had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Wehrmacht forces had deliberately withdrawn from certain positions, allowing the Americans to advance into what strategists call a deliberate encirclement. Once the battalion was fixed in place, German units attacked from 3 directions at once. Elements of the German 2001st Mountain Battalion seized the high ground overlooking the American position. The 933rd Grenadier Regiment cut the supply road behind them. Additional units closed the remaining gaps. Within hours, the 1st Battalion was fully surrounded by an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 German troops. The German forces had spent weeks preparing defensive positions in the Vosges. They had built reinforced bunkers, planted thousands of mines, including wooden shoe mines invisible to metal detectors, and positioned artillery on reverse slopes where American counterfire couldn't hit them. Most devastating was their reliance on tree-burst artillery. Shells fused to explode in the forest canopy, sending deadly showers of metal shards and wood splinters downward, making foxholes nearly useless. Within 24 hours of encirclement, the trapped battalion's situation became dire. German forces launched probing attacks from multiple directions while keeping up constant mortar and artillery harassment. The Americans, expecting only a brief advance, carried minimal ammunition and 3 days of rations. Water became the most urgent shortage. The only source was a stream 60 yards outside the perimeter, fully exposed to German machine gun nests. Men crawled out at night, pressing themselves into the mud as tracers cut across the darkness, trying to fill canteens and helmets. Many never returned. Attempts to resupply by air failed repeatedly. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 365th Fighter Group dropped supplies by parachute, but in the dense forest and fog most packages landed in German hands or were lost. Of numerous supply drops, the trapped battalion recovered only a handful. On October 26, other elements of the 141st Infantry attempted the first rescue. They advanced less than 800 yards before German defenses halted them. The 142nd Infantry Regiment tried next, attempting to flank German positions through a neighboring valley. They walked into a minefield covered by pre-registered artillery and were forced to withdraw with heavy losses. Radio operator Erwin Blonder maintained intermittent contact with division headquarters using the battalion's last functional SCR-300 radio. Limited battery power allowed communication only twice daily. The messages grew increasingly desperate, requests for medical supplies, ammunition, and immediate relief. On October 27, With conventional rescue efforts failing, General Dahlquist made the decision that would define his controversial legacy. He ordered the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to break through to the Lost Battalion. His exact words, recorded by his aide, were, "Get them out at any cost." The 442nd had just been pulled off the line after 9 days of constant fighting during the liberation of Bruyères and Bifontaine. They had taken heavy losses and had been in reserve for only 36 hours, not enough time to integrate replacements, repair gear, or rest. Many soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms in freezing conditions. The 442nd was unique in the U.S. military, a segregated unit made up entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. While they fought in Europe, roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans, including many of their families, were confined in camps across the American West, held without trial under Executive Order 9066. The unit's motto was "Go for broke," Hawaiian pidgin slang meaning to wager everything on one supreme effort. They had already distinguished themselves in Italy, earning more decorations in 6 months than most units received in years. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, commanding the 100th Infantry Battalion attached to the 442nd, protested the order directly to Dahlquist. His men urgently needed rest and winter gear. Dahlquist's reply was blunt: American soldiers were dying, and the 442nd would rescue them. At 0400 hours on October 28, the 442nd began its advance. The plan called for the 100th Battalion to attack on the right flank, the 2nd Battalion on the left, with the 3rd Battalion in reserve. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion would provide support, though the forest and weather made accurate fire nearly impossible. The conditions were nightmarish. Rain had turned every path into muck. The Germans had spent weeks preparing interlocking fields of fire, sowing minefields, and registering artillery on every conceivable approach. The first contact came shortly after dawn. Lead elements of Company E walked directly into an ambush. German MG-42 machine guns erupted from hidden positions at point-blank range. Within moments, several soldiers were down. The 442's response was immediate and violent. Rather than seeking cover and calling for artillery, they fixed bayonets and charged directly into the German positions. This tactic, frontal assault against fortified positions, violated American military doctrine, which emphasized firepower over maneuver. But the Nisei soldiers had learned that aggressive close combat could overcome defensive advantages. German soldiers trained to expect American forces to withdraw when faced with heavy casualties were psychologically unprepared for enemies who kept advancing despite mounting losses. Company K advancing on the opposite flank hit a minefield. The first mine took a soldier's foot off at the ankle. As medics rushed forward, more mines detonated. The company was forced to halt while engineers crawled forward on their bellies, probing for mines with bayonets. By the end of the first day, the 442nd had advanced less than a mile at tremendous cost. But they had achieved something important. They had identified the main German defensive line along a series of ridges that blocked access to the Lost Battalion. October 29th and 30th would see some of the most intense combat of World War II. The key terrain feature was Hill 617. A steep ridge that dominated all approaches to the Lost Battalion. The Germans had turned it into a fortress with 3 separate trench lines, reinforced concrete bunkers, and pre-registered artillery support. The assault began at dawn with a massive artillery barrage from the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. Over 4,000 rounds fell on German positions in 3 hours, but the bunkers built into the reverse slope survived largely intact. When the 442nd Infantry advanced, they met withering fire. What happened next has become legendary in military history. Individual soldiers, seeing their attacks stalling, performed acts of extraordinary heroism. Private Barney Hajiro, a recent replacement from Hawaii, stood up in full view of German positions and walked forward through machine gun fire. He single-handedly destroyed 2 machine gun nests and killed 2 snipers, even after being wounded in the shoulder. His actions inspired his entire company to rise and charge. On another part of the battlefield, Private George Joe Sakato led a charge that turned impending defeat into victory. When his platoon was pinned down and in danger of being overrun, Sakato single-handedly charged a German position defended by 12 soldiers. He killed 12 enemy soldiers, wounded 2, and captured 4, allowing his unit to advance. These individual acts of courage enabled the 442nd to break through German lines. But the cost was staggering. Company K, which had started with 186 men, was reduced to 17 riflemen still able to fight. Company I fared even worse, with only 8 of 185 men remaining unhurt. Technical Sergeant Teo Sainzaki was among the first to reach the Lost Battalion at approximately 1,600 hours on October 30th. His first recorded words to the trapped Texans were, "Need any cigarettes?" The link-up had been achieved, but the battle was far from over. Reaching the Lost Battalion was only half the mission. They still had to be evacuated through 2 miles of enemy-held territory. The Germans immediately launched counterattacks to close the gap, resulting in fierce fighting throughout the night of October 30th. The evacuation began with the wounded. Nisei soldiers carried stretchers through mine-infested forests while German snipers and artillery continued to take their toll. Each trip took hours, with bearers having to stop frequently to rest or take cover from enemy fire. The walking wounded and able-bodied soldiers of the Lost Battalion were evacuated over the next 2 days. Throughout this period, the 442nd had to hold open the corridor against repeated German attempts to cut it. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, with soldiers using knives, entrenching tools, and rifle butts when ammunition ran low. By November 1st, all 211 surviving members of the Lost Battalion had been evacuated. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, had lost 64 men during their encirclement, but the 442nd had paid a far higher price, more than 800 casualties in 6 days of fighting. On November 12, 1944, General Dahlquist ordered the 442nd to assemble for a recognition ceremony. He expected to see the full regiment, approximately 3,000 men. Instead, fewer than 900 soldiers stood in formation. According to multiple witness accounts, Dahlquist asked Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller where the rest of the regiment was. Miller's response became legendary among veterans. "General, this is the regiment. The rest are either dead or in the hospital." The devastating casualties raised immediate questions about Dahlquist's leadership. Why had he sent the 1st Battalion into such an exposed position? Why had he chosen the under-strength 442nd for the rescue when other larger units were available? Many veterans and historians have concluded that Dahlquist viewed the Japanese-American soldiers as more expendable than white units. The controversy deepened when, despite the regiment's devastating casualties, Dahlquist ordered them to continue offensive operations for 9 more days before finally allowing them to rest. Years later, when Dahlquist approached Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Singles at Fort Bragg, saying, "Let bygones be bygones," Singles reportedly refused to shake his hand in front of assembled officers. The heroism displayed during the Lost Battalion rescue should have resulted in numerous medals of honor. Initially, however, not a single soldier received America's highest decoration for this action. Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded to soldiers whose actions clearly met Medal of Honor criteria, a pattern of discrimination that affected Asian American soldiers throughout the war. It would take more than 50 years for justice to be done. In the 1990s, Congress ordered a review of Distinguished Service Cross awards to Asian American World War II veterans. The review board found systematic discrimination in medal awards. On June 21, 2000, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 22 Asian American veterans of World War II, including Barney Hajiro and George Sakato, posthumously for their actions during the Lost Battalion rescue. In his remarks, Clinton acknowledged the injustice. Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated. The statistics of the Lost Battalion rescue tell a stark story. Men rescued: 211 surviving members of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, 442nd casualties, more than 800 killed, wounded, and missing. Casualty ratio nearly 4-to-1. Days of combat: 6 days to reach the battalion, 9 more days of continued operations. But numbers cannot capture the human dimension. These were American soldiers whose families were imprisoned by their own government, who volunteered to fight for a country that questioned their loyalty, who suffered casualties that would have broken most units, all to prove they were American enough. The psychological impact on survivors was severe. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, though mental health support for veterans was minimal at the time. The Japanese cultural concept of gamuring the unbearable with patience and dignity meant most suffered in silence. German military records and post-war accounts reveal that Wehrmacht forces were unprepared for the intensity of the 442 assault. The Japanese American soldiers violated German tactical expectations. They attacked fortified positions frontally, accepted casualties that should have stopped any advance, and continued fighting even when wounded. General Friedrich Wiese's after-action reports noted that the 442nd displayed a disregard for casualties unprecedented in our experience fighting American forces. German soldiers reported that wounded Nisei soldiers continued fighting, that units maintained cohesion despite losses exceeding 75%, and that the intensity of close combat exceeded anything they had experienced. The defeat in the Vosges forced German military leadership to reassess their assumptions about American military capabilities and the role of racial minorities in the U.S. Army. The supposedly inferior Japanese American soldiers had broken through positions the Wehrmacht considered impregnable. The relationship between the rescued Texans and their Nisei rescuers became one of the most enduring legacies of the battle. Many of the Texans had grown up in the segregated South and had never met a Japanese American before. The shared ordeal transformed initial suspicion into lifelong brotherhood. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally proclaimed all members of the 442nd to be honorary Texans in recognition of their sacrifice. Veterans of both units maintained contact for decades, attending each other's reunions, weddings, and funerals. When anti-Japanese sentiment flared during economic downturns in later decades, Lost Battalion veterans were among the first to speak out in defense of Japanese Americans. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the price the Nisei had paid to prove their loyalty. The Lost Battalion rescue had implications far beyond its military importance. The extraordinary sacrifice of the 442nd made it impossible to justify continued discrimination against Japanese Americans. How could America maintain that these were disloyal citizens when they had suffered such casualties rescuing white soldiers? The 442nd became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history, earning 21 Medals of Honor, most awarded decades later, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, 5,200 Bronze Stars, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 8 Presidential Unit citations. Their service helped pave the way for redress for Japanese American internment. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for internment and providing compensation to survivors. Many 442nd veterans were instrumental in achieving this recognition. Military historians continue to debate whether the Lost Battalion rescue was necessary and whether the use of the 442nd constituted discrimination. The evidence suggests complex motivations and systemic prejudice. General Dahlquist consistently assigned the 442nd to the most dangerous missions. He ignored requests for rest and reinforcement. Most tellingly, he had other units available, larger, fresher units that could have attempted the rescue. The tactical decision to send the under-strength 442nd rather than fresh units from the 36th Division remains controversial. Some historians argue the 442nd was chosen because they were the best unit available. Others contend they were selected because Japanese American casualties would be more politically acceptable than losses in white units. What is undeniable is that the 442nd could not refuse the mission without seeming to confirm suspicions about their loyalty. They were trapped by prejudice as surely as the Lost Battalion was trapped by Germans. The Lost Battalion Rescue offers profound lessons about citizenship, loyalty, and the cost of prejudice. It demonstrates that questioning citizens' loyalty based on ancestry weakens military effectiveness and violates American principles. It shows how marginalized groups often must pay the highest price to prove their belonging. Most importantly, it proves that American identity is not determined by ancestry, but by sacrifice and service. The Nisei soldiers defined patriotism not as blind allegiance but as fighting for American ideals even when America fell short of those ideals. The rescue also demonstrated the strength that diversity brings to military forces. The 442's cohesion born from shared marginalization made them more effective than conventional units. Their determination to prove themselves drove them to extraordinary achievement. As the decades passed, the number of survivors dwindled. Veterans of both the 442nd and the Lost Battalion carried physical and psychological scars from the verge, but they also carried an unbreakable bond forged in those terrible days. Lost Battalion veteran Martin Higgins, who had sent desperate radio messages during the encirclement, maintained lifelong friendships with his rescuers. Before his death, he said, "Those boys saved our lives while their families were locked up back home. That's not just courage, that's a kind of heroism I still can't fully understand." Veteran Susito reflected, "We went up that mountain to save American soldiers. Not white soldiers or Texas soldiers, American soldiers. That's what we were too despite everything, American soldiers." Today, the rescue of the Lost Battalion is studied in military mice as an example of small unit tactics and extraordinary determination. At West Point, a plaque honoring the 442nd reads, "These soldiers prove that uncommon valor was a common virtue, but the greater legacy is social and moral." The sacrifice of the 442nd helped transform American understanding of citizenship and belonging. Their service made it impossible to maintain that loyalty could be determined by race or ancestry. Veterans of the 442nd used their moral authority to fight for civil rights. After the war, Daniel Inag, who lost his right arm fighting in Italy with the 442nd, became Hawaii's first congressman and served in the Senate for nearly 50 years. Spark Matsunaga, another 442nd veteran, joined him in the Senate. Together they were instrumental in achieving redress for internment. The Lost Battalion rescue ultimately reveals the terrible cost of prejudice not just to its victims but to the nation that harbors it. The 442nd's excessive casualties were partly due to their need to prove loyalty through extraordinary sacrifice. America lost many of its best citizens because prejudice demanded they pay a higher price than others. The battle also revealed shortcomings in military leadership when clouded by racial prejudice. Elquist's apparent readiness to risk Japanese American lives more freely than those of white soldiers led to needless losses and remains a blemish on his service record. Yet from this injustice arose something remarkable, a demonstration that American ideals could prevail over American biases. The Nisei soldiers fought not for an idealized America, but for the America that could be, should be, and occasionally managed to become. October 30, 1944, 1,600 hours. Technical Sergeant Teo Sainzaki of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerged from the forest and made contact with the Lost Battalion. After 6 days of some of the bloodiest combat in the European theater, and more than 800 casualties, the link-up was achieved. The exhausted Texans could hardly believe their rescuers were Japanese American. Some had never encountered an Asian American before. Yet here they were, having endured nearly unimaginable costs to save fellow Americans. This moment, where prejudice met sacrifice, assumption met reality, and Americans saved Americans regardless of race, embodied both the tragedy and triumph of the Lost Battalion rescue. It reflected America at its worst, sending citizens to die to prove loyalty while incarcerating their families, but also America at its best, when courage rises above bias and shared sacrifice forges unbreakable bonds. In 2000, the Gopher Broke Monument was dedicated in Los Angeles, honoring all Japanese American soldiers of World War II. The monument lists more than 16,000 names of those who served, including over 700 who gave their lives. At the dedication, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Herschel Gober remarked, "These soldiers fought 2 wars, one against fascism abroad, one against prejudice at home. They won both, though at a cost that should humble us all." The monument bears the 442nd's motto, "Go for broke." Perhaps the most meaningful tribute comes from Lost Battalion veterans who ensured their rescuers' names were included on their own memorials. As one Texas veteran said, "They are brothers. They earned that with blood." The rescue of the Lost Battalion transcends military history to stand as a defining moment in American identity. It proved that heroism is not bound by color, that loyalty cannot be measured by ancestry, and that the deepest patriotism often comes from those with the most reason to question their nation. German officers who dismissed the Nisei as inferior combatants learned that bravery transcends race. American generals who saw them as expendable realized that every citizen's life holds equal value. Texas soldiers who had never met a Japanese American discovered that brotherhood is forged through sacrifice, not heritage. Most importantly, America came to understand that its strongest defenders could emerge from the most marginalized communities. Strength lies in diversity, and true citizenship is measured not by perfection, but by striving to make the country better. Military historians continue to study the Lost Battalion rescue as one of the most extraordinary chapters in U.S. Army history. The tactical feat, breaking through entrenched German positions despite overwhelming odds, is remarkable, but the moral significance eclipses the military accomplishment. The operation proved that American ideals, equality, justice, liberty, can overcome ingrained prejudices. It showed that what makes America exceptional is not flawlessness, but the ability to redeem itself through sacrifice. From a purely operational standpoint, the mission was costly. Over 800 casualties to rescue 211 men defies conventional principles of military efficiency. Yet history measures success by different standards. Some victories justify any cost. Certain stands must be taken regardless of price. Some values must be defended even unto death. The 442nd understood this. They ascended that mountain not only to save the Lost Battalion, but to uphold America's claim to moral leadership. They fought not just against German forces, but against the bias that questioned their rightful place in America. They bled not merely for military success, but for the principle that all Americans are created equal. The story of the Lost Battalion rescue ultimately reflects the complexity of American identity and the redeeming power of sacrifice. It reminds us that citizenship is earned not by birth, but through service, that prejudice weakens the nation it purports to protect, and that America's strength lies not in uniformity, but in the resolve of diverse peoples to pursue a shared destiny. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team went for broke in the Vosges Mountains. They gave everything, held nothing back. In doing so, they not only saved 211 trapped soldiers, they helped preserve America's soul. Even in the nation's darkest moments of prejudice and fear, it produced citizens of such extraordinary courage that both ally and adversary alike could not help but marvel. The forest has reclaimed Hill 617. Foxholes are filled with leaves. Bunkers have crumbled. Yet the memory endures of young men who climbed an impossible mountain, bled for those who scorned them, and died for a country that had not yet learned to embrace them. They were the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They were Japanese Americans. They were patriots. They were heroes. And above all else, they were Americans. Their sacrifice echoes across generations, reminding us that freedom is never free, that citizenship demands service, and that the highest form of patriotism is fighting to make your nation worthy of its ideals. In the Vosges dark forests, marginalized Americans demonstrated that loyalty cannot be doubted when written in blood, that bravery transcends color, and that America's true power lies in its people standing together to defend democracy. The Lost Battalion was rescued, but more importantly, an ideal endured. In America, citizenship is not defined by origin, but by the willingness to sacrifice for human dignity and equality. The 442nd embodied this truth with unmistakable clarity. They earned their place in America not through words, but deeds, not by birthright, but through sacrifice, not through acceptance, but through undeniable courage. Their legacy is clear. From the darkest prejudice can rise the brightest heroism. Those deemed least loyal may prove most faithful, and America's greatest strength is not uniformity, but shared commitment to ideals greater than any individual, group, or bias. The Lost Battalion rescue remains among the most extraordinary moments in American military history, not only for what was accomplished, but for who accomplished it and why. In those 6 days of October 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team did more than save a battalion, they helped preserve the idea of America itself.